Chapter 1. The Taking of the State. January of 1971 arrived, like a long-held breath finally released. A breath that the city of Kampala did not realize had been held for fear and calculation. The president was away, and the army moved with the efficiency of men who had practiced secrecy as a craft. Convoys cut the capital into islands. Checkpoints multiplied like the closing of shutters. And in the middle of that changing map, a soldier with a booming voice and an appetite for spectacle stepped forward and claimed the microphone. He wore medals, he smiled for the cameras, and he promised order. For a people exhausted by faction and factional quarrels, order was temptation. For a man with a taste for absolute command, it was an open door. The first names taken were not random. They belonged to those who could speak for the rule of law, the institutions that might stand between personal will and national procedure. Benedicto Kiwanuka, once Uganda's first black chief, justice and later a national leader with a slow, deliberate voice and a dedication to legal process, was seized from his office and taken into custody in September of 1972. He would be dead within days, his removal a signal that the judiciary itself could no longer be trusted to remain neutral. This was not a private revenge. It was a public lesson. Kiwanuka's abduction and assassination marked the moment state power slipped into the practice of removal, a practice that turns names into absences. People learned to walk around Dot as those first arrests multiplied the machinery that would sustain terror took form. Offices with respectable names housed new functions. Lists were compiled. Loyalties were audited. People were called in under pretexts that later became dreadful patterns. Prominent ministers and officials who had once stood near the center of power became convenient targets when they ceased to be useful. Internal dissent, real or imagined, was answered with disappearance. Charles Obath Ofumbi, who had served in senior government roles, was among those who vanished in the wave of removals in 1977 that also took other high officials. Official accounts offered accidents and confusion, but eyewitness testimony and later reporting made clear that these were political murders used to tidy up inconvenient facts. The removal of such men signaled that proximity to power did not protect. In fact, it made one a target for elimination once the calculus of loyalty shifted. The regime's reach did not stop with the political elite. Religious leaders who dared to speak were marked with equal severity. Shinani Luwum, Archbishop of the Church of Uganda, confronted the state with a rare public rebuke, refusing to remain silent as people disappeared from streets and courts. He was arrested in February of 1977 and died very soon after while in government custody. The official story was a car accident, but contemporaneous accounts and later testimony, including reports by ministers who fled and wrote of what they had seen, make plain that Luwum was murdered in retaliation for his outspokenness. The killing of a spiritual leader created a new kind of public terror because churches had been among the few spaces still trusted for moral voice. Once that sanctuary was penetrated, the simple acts of daily worship itself felt more dangerous. The pattern widened and hardened. A senior minister who later broke from the regime, Henry Kiemba, documented how the state's apparatus functioned in his book and testimony. He described how the security services and units with bland names became instruments of removal and how extrajudicial killings, disappearances, and brutal intimidation were normal parts of governance under the ruler. That testimony, even from the vantage of a former insider, became one of the earliest public windows into how systematic the abuses were, and how deeply the culture of fear had been embedded in official practice. The outside world would learn of particular incidents that earned headlines, but it would not always perceive the daily, grinding pattern that made entire communities live as if a bell might ring at any hour and someone would be taken. For those who lived through it, the first years were not merely historical dates. They were the calendar of absences and the geography of silence. Towns learned to speak in code. Markets closed earlier. Teachers avoided certain chapters. Families learned the precise hour to check for a knock that would never come. The state had become a predator that preferred to work by stripping ordinary life of certainty. Each ledger entry that removed the name from the rolls was both punishment and policy. The result was a society that adapted to fear, with habits that would persist long after the convoys left, and the man who had seized the state boarded a plane and disappeared into exile. Yet that exile would not make the missing return, nor would it erase the ledger of loss the nation, now kept by memory and testimony. Chapter 2. The machinery of disappearance. The palace declared calm, but outside its gates, a new organism was feeding. It had names that sounded harmless, almost bureaucratic: the State Research Bureau and the Public Safety Unit. But these were not think tanks or police desks. They were the fangs of a predator, moving without hesitation through Kampala and across the provinces. Under their banner, Uganda learned the meaning of disappearance. A word that once meant absence now meant certainty of death. At the heart of this machine was a network of detention centers, with Nakasero, Nile mansions, and Makindi military prison whispered like curses. These places had no windows to the outside world. Men went in on suspicion of disloyalty and were swallowed. Few came out, and those who did spoke in fragments. They told of suffocating cells, interrogations that blurred into beatings, screams echoing across nights until silence fell, and then footsteps as another body was dragged away. The first great wave of disappearances came after Amin's coup in 1971, targeting soldiers loyal to the ousted President Milton Obote. The Akoli and Lanji ethnic groups, who had formed Obote's backbone in the army, were systematically purged. Truckloads of them were taken from barracks, lined up, and shot, their bodies hidden in mass graves. Estimates suggest thousands of Akoli and Lanji were executed within the first 2 years. The elimination was both tribal and political, a bloodletting designed to cauterize any thought of return. The deaths were not limited to the military. Benedicto Kiwanuka, the Chief Justice of Uganda's Supreme Court, was dragged from his chambers in September 1972. His crime was refusing to bend the law to Amin's demands. Witnesses reported seeing him shoved into a car by armed men. Days later, his body was found bearing signs of torture. His murder was not only the silencing of a man, but the symbolic assassination of Uganda's justice system itself. Another name that darkened the rolls was Janani Luwum, Archbishop of the Church of Uganda. In February 1977, he publicly accused the regime of bloodshed, presenting Amin with a petition that condemned killings and disappearances. For this act of defiance, Luwum was arrested alongside ministers Charles Obothofumbi and Erinayo Orema. All three were reported dead within hours. The official statement was insultingly false, claiming they died in a car crash while attempting escape. Survivors and defectors like Henry Kiemba, who later documented the events in his book, A State of Blood, testified that the Archbishop and the two ministers were shot on Amin's orders. Churches across Uganda fell into mourning. Bells tolled, and the silence of congregations was heavier than any chant dot in July 1976. During the Entebbe hostage crisis, Amin's cruelty turned outward to the world. When Israeli commandos stormed the airport and rescued hostages, Amin was humiliated. His revenge fell on an elderly woman, Dora Bloch, a hostage hospitalized in Kampala during the rescue. She was dragged from her hospital bed by Amin's men, taken to a safe house, and murdered. Her body was dumped in a sugar plantation. The act was pointless cruelty, a warning that defeat abroad would be paid for with blood at home. Behind these killings stood men who enabled the machinery. Isaac Maliamungu, feared for his brutality, was known as one of Amin's most ruthless enforcers. Mustafa Adrisi, though later sidelined, initially lent weight to Amin's inner circle of terror. The State Research Bureau, run at one point by Colonel Juma Ali, was notorious for carrying out systematic torture and executions. These were not ghosts in uniforms, but identifiable architects of state terror. Numbers became a language of horror. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and survivors' testimonies estimate that 100,000 to 500,000 people were killed under Amin's 8-year rule. The figures are so large they blur, but behind each one was a name, a face, a family that waited at a door for someone who never returned. The disappearances were not random sparks of violence. They were the structure of governance. By erasing critics, rivals, and innocents alike, Amin built silence into Uganda's bloodstream. Fear became the only reliable law. Chapter 3. The Purge of the Army and the Night of Ethnic Blood. The coup of January 1971 did not end with Idi Amin smiling in front of cameras and promising a new dawn. That was only the surface. Beneath it lay a campaign of systematic cleansing that would redraw the veins of the army and carve fear into the marrow of Ugandan society. The first victims were the soldiers who had once stood loyal to Milton Obote, Uganda's ousted president. They were men from the Akoli and Langi ethnic groups, men who had trained, marched, and bled for a country that had suddenly shifted beneath their boots. Their uniforms became death warrants. Their loyalty to Obote was not questioned in a courtroom. It was assumed in barracks, and in those barracks it was punished with bullets. Eyewitness accounts describe convoys rolling into camps at Imbarara, Jinja, and Moroto. Officers were ordered to assemble their men. Those with names linked to the old order were separated from their comrades. Trucks drove them away under the guise of transfer. The soldiers left behind knew what it meant. Hours later, gunfire crackled in the distance. Later still, pits were found in the earth, wide enough to swallow dozens at once. Thousands of Akoli and Langi soldiers were purged in this way between 1971 and 1972, a campaign of ethnic slaughter disguised as military reorganization. The barracks that had once echoed with drills now held a silence so absolute it felt like an accusation against those who survived. One figure loomed large in this butchery: Isaac Maliamungu, a colonel feared even among Amin's closest men. Survivors later called him Amin's chief butcher. Stories followed him like flies. Soldiers spoke of how he laughed as he ordered executions, of how he personally supervised mass shootings in the countryside. Under his eye, the Akoli and Langi purge became more than policy. It became ritualized terror, a way to remind every man in uniform that survival depended not on merit, but on submission to Amin's single quotes S commands. The machinery of death was not always subtle. Trucks would arrive at night in neighborhoods near the Nile mansions in Kampala. Neighbors would hear the boots, the pounding on doors, the muffled cries. Entire families of suspected Obote sympathizers disappeared, their houses left as mute shells. The city learned new habits. Curtains closed earlier. Children were told not to mention names at school. Men learned to burn letters that might reveal kinship to the wrong tribe. The purge of the army seeped outward, soaking into civil life until suspicion hung over every meal and prayer. A Makindi military prison, already notorious, filled with new captives. Some were officers accused of plotting against Amin. Others were mere corporals or sergeants, unlucky enough to share blood with the Akoli or Lenji. Amnesty International. Reports from the mid-1970s describe cells crammed to bursting, prisoners kept without charge or trial, and waves of executions carried out under cover of darkness. The pattern was clinical. Arrest at dusk, interrogation in the small hours. By dawn, silence. The family would wait outside with food for weeks, sometimes months, never told that the man they sought lay buried in an unmarked grave outside the city. In the north, in villages tied by lineage to Obote's supporters, soldiers swept through with casual cruelty. Livestock were seized. Women were assaulted. Young men were rounded up, accused of being rebels, and never seen again. These were not spontaneous acts of revenge. They were organized campaigns meant to bleed the Akoli and Lanji of their strength, to hollow them out so that Amin's base, the Kakwa, his own people, and the Nubians, with whom he shared long ties, could dominate the ranks. By the end of 1972, Amin's army was no longer Uganda's army. It was Amin's private host, bound by blood, fear, and loot. The purge reverberated beyond the military. Civilian ministries became hunting grounds. Those with Lanji or Akoli names were quietly dismissed, replaced by Amin's loyalists. Judges and lawyers who had defended constitutionalism were silenced. The assassination of Chief Justice Benedicto Kiwanuka that September, dragged from his office, tortured, and murdered, was the loudest signal that law itself had no refuge. His killing did not merely terrify the legal community. It signaled to the nation that no one was too important, too visible, or too respected to be erased. The terror bled into religious life as well. Archbishop Luwum, who dared to denounce state killings, would not yet be taken until 1977. But even in these early years, the churches felt the pressure. Priests were warned not to sermonize about justice. Congregations shrank, not from loss of faith, but from fear that gathering itself might be noted. Historians estimate that between 10,000 and 20,000 soldiers and civilians from the Akoli and Lanji communities perished in the first 2 years after Amin's coup. These were not faceless numbers. They were the men who had carried rifles for Uganda's independence. They were fathers and brothers, teachers and clerks. They were the skeleton of the old state, methodically broken and buried so that Amin's new skeleton, sharpened, loyal, and brutal, could hold the country upright. The purge achieved its purpose. By 1973, the army no longer held competing centers of power. It was a beast with one brain, and that brain beat in rhythm with Amin's moods. Every officer understood that ambition could be fatal, that silence was survival, and that obedience was the only currency that mattered. Uganda had become not merely a nation under dictatorship, but a garrison state where uniforms held more weight than law, and where blood was both the price of loyalty and the warning against betrayal. The purge was the foundation. Upon it, Amin would build his empire of fear, and upon it, Uganda would stumble into the long night of blood and silence that was only beginning. Chapter 4: The State Research Bureau and the Architecture of Terror. If the purge of the Akoli and Langi soldiers was the opening wound of Amin's rule, the construction of his secret police was the infection that spread through every artery of the nation. By 1972, the State Research Bureau, the SRB, was no longer a vague intelligence wing. It had become the architecture of terror, the system through which Amin's dictatorship breathed. What it studied was not science or progress. It studied names. It studied loyalties. It studied fear. The SRB was headquartered at the once proud Nile Mansions Hotel in Kampala, a luxury complex that had become infamous as the very mouth of hell. Behind its mirrored walls, the screams of prisoners rose through the night, muffled but not silenced. In those rooms, men and women were interrogated until the line between question and punishment disappeared. Prisoners were hung from beams, beaten with iron rods, and drowned in silence when they ceased to make sound. Very few who entered the Nile mansions ever emerged, and those who did were broken vessels. Emptied of defiance, the SRB's director for much of Amin's rule was Colonel Juma Butabaka, a man who understood that bureaucracy can be more terrifying than rage. Files were kept even as bodies were buried. Lists were circulated, stamped, and approved. Disappearances became administrative acts. To be marked by the SRB was not to be tried. It was to be erased by signature. Those lists included ministers, military men, businessmen, students, even clergymen. Their names were linked into the death book, and once written, they could not be unwritten. Another of Amin's enforcers, Isaac Malia Mangu, was whispered about in bars and markets with a mixture of terror and disbelief. Stories clung to him like carrion birds. It was said he ordered executions for amusement, that he personally shot prisoners whose pleas annoyed him, that he forced condemned men to sing hymns before they were cut down. Whether all the stories were true hardly mattered. The fear was true enough. Malia Mungu embodied the SRB's logic. Cruelty as both punishment and theater, a demonstration to the living of what awaited them if they strayed. The SRB's work extended far beyond the capital. Regional branches spread into towns like Bali, Gulu, and Arua, each one a node in the web of terror. Local commanders received lists, carried out arrests, and shipped prisoners to central prisons such as Makindye Military Prison. Makindye became synonymous with disappearance. Families would arrive at its gates, clutching food and clothing for loved ones, only to be told the prisoner was not here. Days later, weeks later, the food would be returned untouched. The message was clear: your loved one is gone. And so is your right to ask, where that by 1973. Ordinary Ugandans spoke of these prisons as if they were haunted houses, places where the dead walked but never left. They became warning signs along the psychic map of the nation. Do not walk too near. Do not mention names tied to them. Do not risk being caught in their net. Even the guards were uneasy, for to serve in such places was to carry the stench of death on your clothes. To know that if you wavered, the uniform on your back would not protect you from joining the condemned. The SRB also policed Amin's government itself. Ministers who grew too ambitious or who whispered dissent were called into meetings that became funerals. Charles Obeth El-Fumbi, Minister of Internal Affairs, was once close to Amin. In February 1977, he was summoned, arrested, and killed alongside Ireneo Orema, Minister of Lands and Housing, and Archbishop Shenani Luwum. Officially, their deaths were attributed to a car accident. The lie was so transparent it deepened the dread. Everyone knew they had been executed. Everyone understood that even men who dined at the same table as Amin were not safe from the machinery of the SRB. These assassinations revealed the other function of the Bureau: to maintain the delicate balance of loyalty by constant pruning. No official could grow too powerful. No minister could forget that the state belonged to one man. If ambition sprouted, the SRB cut it down. If conscience flickered, the SRB smothered it. This kept Amin enthroned not by trust, but by paralysis. Men obeyed not because they believed in him, but because they feared the sound of a knock at their door. The numbers told a story even when the state refused to. Between 1971 and 1979, it is estimated that 100,000 to 500,000 people were killed under Amin's rule, and the SRB was responsible for the bulk of these murders. Reports from Amnesty International and testimonies of defectors like Henry Kiemba made it plain: the SRB was not an intelligence agency. It was a conveyor belt of death. Each case followed the same rhythm: arrest, detention, interrogation, silence, disposal. The horror of the Bureau was not simply the loss of life. It was the transformation of life into a waiting room of dread. A whole nation lived as if each day might be its last, without reason or warning. Children grew up in homes where the mention of a name could summon disaster. Parents taught their sons and daughters not to repeat conversations, not to trust neighbors, not to question uniforms. This was Amin's true triumph. He did not just kill bodies. He killed voices, and in their absence, silence reigned as his greatest accomplice. The SRB's shadow stretched into every corner of Uganda. It was a shadow without edges, because no one knew when it might fall across them. That was its power, and that was Amin's genius for terror. Not only to kill, but to make the entire nation feel already half dead, walking in a fog where the next disappearance might be their own. Chapter 5: The Expulsion of Uganda's Asians. Theft as State Policy. In August of 1972, a decree came down like a thunderclap, a proclamation that would rip through Uganda's social fabric and collapse its economy. Idi Amin announced that all Asians, those of Indian and Pakistani descent, had 90 days to leave the country. These were not faceless foreigners. They were Ugandan citizens, many born and raised in the country, their families present for generations. They were shopkeepers, accountants, mechanics, teachers, doctors, the spine of Uganda's commerce, and middle class. But to Amin, they were scapegoats, targets of envy and resentment, and a convenient distraction from the failures his regime had already produced. The order was framed as liberation. Amin declared that Asians had milked Uganda's wealth, and that it was time for real Ugandans to reclaim their land and businesses. He styled himself as a nationalist avenger, a man reclaiming dignity for Africans. Yet the truth was uglier. He saw in the expulsion an opportunity to reward his inner circle with stolen wealth and to ignite a fire of populism that could mask the hunger gnawing at the streets of Kampala. The numbers were staggering. Between 60,000 and 80,000 Asians were forced to flee. They carried what little they could pack in suitcases, leaving behind homes, factories, schools, shops, warehouses, and farms built across decades. Banks closed accounts. Families who had served Uganda loyally as civil servants and professionals were told they had no place in the only country they had ever known. Airports became scenes of chaos and heartbreak. Planes carried away entire families, clutching documents, while their properties were cataloged and redistributed by Amin's men like loot. One voice that recorded the trauma was Henry Kiemba, once Amin's Minister of Health, who defected and later published A State of Blood. Kiemba described how the expulsion was not only theft but humiliation, designed to strip dignity from those being driven out. Businesses were handed to soldiers and cronies who had no knowledge of how to run them. Cars, radios, refrigerators, and entire warehouses of goods were divided up as though Uganda itself had become Amin's personal spoils. The personal cruelty of the policy was magnified by its hypocrisy. While Amin told the public that Asians were enemies of Uganda, many had been integral to building its infrastructure. Doctors of Asian descent had treated the sick across Kampala. Teachers had educated Uganda's children. Merchants had kept supplies moving from ports to villages. Their departure left a skeletal economy, unable to supply even basic goods. The aftershocks were immediate. Shops that once buzzed with trade closed their shutters. Hospitals reported shortages of essential medicines. Fuel lines stretched for miles as mismanaged distribution collapsed. Sugar, salt, soap, kerosene, items that had once seemed ordinary, became luxuries. The government pretended that Africanization would fill the void, but reality was brutal. The men given control of businesses had no training or interest in running them. They sold stock, pocketed cash, and abandoned the shells of businesses to rot. Factories stopped producing. Warehouses emptied. The economy, once stable, entered a spiral of collapse. Amin's justification grew louder as reality grew darker. He gave interviews to foreign press, styling himself a hero of African nationalism. He claimed divine inspiration, even saying dreams from God had commanded him to expel the Asians. In truth, the policy aligned with his need to maintain a network of patronage. The seizure of wealth gave him currency with his officers and cronies, keeping them loyal with cars, houses, and shops stripped from the expelled families. The economy was gutted, but his grip on power was, for the moment, reinforced. There were casualties beyond the economic collapse. The human tragedy was immense. Families who had known no other homeland scattered across the world. Britain received over 27,000 expelled Ugandans. Canada, another 6,000, India thousands more. In the panic, some families were split apart, children placed on planes while parents struggled to secure documents. There are testimonies of mothers weeping in airports, clutching children who did not understand why they were leaving their friends, their homes, and the graves of their ancestors. And then there were those who never made it to the plains. Not every expulsion was clean. Soldiers exploited the decree for extortion. Wealthy Asian families were stopped at roadblocks, robbed of jewelry, cash, and luggage. Some were detained until they signed over deeds. Others simply vanished, their names joining the long register of Amin's victims. While the world's cameras caught the scenes at Entebbe Airport, the darker reality unfolded on the backroads and in the barracks, where greed and cruelty claimed lives that should have been spared. The international community responded with condemnation, but words did little. Uganda had been hollowed out. A once thriving commercial class was gone. By 1973, economic reports showed catastrophic decline. GDP fell, factories rusted. Coffee, Uganda's main export, became a channel for corruption. Its profits funneled into Amin's inner circle while the country starved. The people who had once bought goods on credit now stood in endless queues for food that no longer arrived. The expulsion of Asians revealed the core truth of Amin's rule. It was never about ideology. It was about survival through theft, terror, and scapegoating. Every crisis was answered by eliminating a group, erasing a critic, or silencing a community. First it was Obote soldiers. Then it was judges, ministers, and priests. Then it was the Asian community. Each purge left the country weaker, more silent, and more broken. By the end of 1972, Uganda was an economy in ruins, a society cut apart, and a people learning to live with hunger and silence as daily companions. The expulsion was not a single act. It was another chapter in the long horror story, another brick in the fortress of fear Amin built around himself. And like the mass killings in the barracks, it left a scar so deep it would not heal for generations. Chapter 6. The Assassination, the Day God Was Silenced. By 1977, Uganda was drowning in silence. The army had been purged, the judiciary had been broken, the Asians expelled, and the prisons filled with the faceless dead. Yet one voice remained, a voice that cut through the fog of terror with the weight of conscience and the fire of faith. That voice belonged to Archbishop Chinani Luwum, leader of the Church of Uganda, a man of calm dignity who refused to barter his God for Amin's fear. His presence was a light in the gathering dark, and for that very reason, it had to be extinguished. Chinani Luwum had risen from humble beginnings in the Akoli region. Ordained in 1956, and by 1974, appointed as Archbishop of the Church of Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and Bogazire. He was a man unafraid of speaking truth in the language of faith. As Amin's reign grew bloodier, Luwum began to denounce the killings, the disappearances, and the corruption in public sermons. He told his congregations that God's law was higher than any man's decree. In a country where every whisper could be fatal, his words rang like a bell in the night. By early 1977, the Archbishop had crossed a line Amin could not tolerate. He and fellow bishops wrote a letter condemning the regime's mass killings and the reign of terror imposed by the State Research Bureau. The petition named the unspeakable, that Amin's security forces were murdering innocent Ugandans and ruling through fear. It was delivered directly to Amin. This was not a rumor passed in markets, not a secret confession to the foreign press. It was an open rebuke, signed by the most senior churchman in Uganda. The dictator's reaction was swift. On February 16, 1977, Luwum was summoned to a meeting at State House. With him were Charles Ofumbi, Minister of Internal Affairs, and Ireneo Wilson Oraima, Minister of Lands and Housing, both senior officials who had also fallen under suspicion of disloyalty. They were accused of plotting to overthrow the government with foreign aid. That evening, Amin's state radio announced that the 3 men had been arrested for treason. Hours later, the same radio reported that they had died in a car accident while attempting escape. That it was a grotesque lie, transparent even by the standards of Amin's propaganda. Witnesses later testified that Luwum, Ofumbi, and Oraima had been shot on Amin's orders, executed at close range inside the presidential grounds. Former Minister Henry Kemba, who fled the country soon after, confirmed in a state of blood that the Archbishop and his companions had been murdered in cold blood. Kemba's testimony carried the raw weight of one who had been present in the palace that night and escaped with his life only by chance. The reaction across Uganda was immediate and profound. Churches rang their bells in mourning. Congregations wept openly, something few dared to do in public under Amin's shadow. For ordinary Ugandans, the message was unbearable. If even the Archbishop, God's own shepherd, could be slaughtered, then no sanctuary remained. The church, long a refuge for the frightened, had been desecrated. Faith itself had been gagged. Internationally, the murder of Janani Luwum shocked the conscience of the world. Britain, the United States, and the United Nations condemned the killing, but Amin laughed off their protests. He gave interviews mocking the idea that he had ordered the Archbishop's death. Yet outside Uganda, the story stuck. Newspapers called him the Butcher of Uganda. Human rights groups elevated Luwum as a martyr, and in 2015, the Anglican Church canonized him as a saint. But in 1977, there was no halo, only grief, and the grinding certainty that the nightmare in Uganda had no moral boundaries left. For Ugandans, the Archbishop's murder deepened the atmosphere of dread. Families stopped attending church, fearful of raids during services. Priests learned to measure their words like men carrying explosives. The congregation became quiet, their prayers whispered under breath rather than sung. In villages, the story of Luwum's death was told in hushed tones, parents explaining to children why the church bells tolled without joy. It was not only a spiritual wound, but a national one, an amputation of hope that the killing of Ofumbi and Oraima alongside the Archbishop revealed the dual nature of Amin's terror. No one was safe. Not the ministers who sat at his table, not the generals who marched beside him, not the priests who prayed for the nation. Loyalty was temporary, usefulness was fleeting, and the price of misjudging Amin's mood was death. By combining the assassination of a saintly figure with that of political insiders, Amin showed that both the righteous and the ambitious could be ground beneath his heel. The Archbishop's death also intensified the isolation of Uganda. Western aid dried up, diplomats left in disgust. Yet Amin remained insulated by alliances with Libya's Muammar Gaddafi and the Palestine Liberation Organization, both of whom saw in him a useful strongman to wield against Western influence. The blood on his hands mattered less than his willingness to play the role of anti-colonial avenger on the world stage. Uganda, meanwhile, bled unseen. The murder of Janani Luwum marked a pivot in Amin's reign. It was not simply another disappearance, another body in a shallow grave. It was the murder of a symbol, the murder of Uganda's conscience. In killing him, Amin proclaimed that even God had no authority in Uganda, only Amin did. And once that truth was absorbed, silence deepened into despair. The people lived not only in fear of death, but in fear that there was no longer a higher power to protect them. Uganda had become a graveyard of hope. The day God was silenced was the day Amin's dictatorship reached its purest form. naked, sacrilegious, and unrestrained. Chapter 7. International Humiliation. Domestic Revenge. By the middle of 1976, Idi Amin stood at the height of his power. He had already styled himself with grandiose titles: Field Marshal Dr. Idi Amin, conqueror of the British Empire in Africa and beyond. He paraded himself as Africa's champion, a man whose voice could not be silenced and whose laughter filled the radio waves. Yet behind the bravado, his grip on the nation was trembling. Uganda was an empty shell. The economy had collapsed under the weight of his plunder. Shortages were everywhere. The queues for sugar and salt wound through Kampala like snakes, and the people whispered that their ruler was more clown than king. What Amin craved was a stage big enough to restore his legend. Fate gave it to him. In July of 1976, when an Air France jetliner was hijacked by Palestinian and German militants and forced to land at Entebbe Airport, Amin seized the chance with both hands. He welcomed the hijackers as comrades in the struggle against imperialism. He toured the hostages, smiling broadly, assuring them of their safety, even as they sat on the floor of the terminal, surrounded by armed guards. Photographers captured him waving at frightened passengers, his bulk towering like a grotesque parody of a benevolent host. To Amin, the crisis was a gift. It allowed him to posture as an ally of the Palestinian cause, to taunt Israel, and to preen before the eyes of the Arab world. But what the dictator did not see was the quiet, meticulous planning underway thousands of miles away. On the night of July 3rd and 4th of 1976, Israeli commandos launched Operation Thunderbolt. Under the cover of darkness, C-130 aircraft flew across Africa, landing at Entebbe with surgical precision. Commandos poured out, storming the terminal where the hostages were held. The gunfire was brief but decisive. Within 90 minutes, 102 hostages were freed. The hijackers were killed. 3 hostages died in the crossfire, and 1 Israeli commander, Yonatan Netanyahu, fell during the raid. But the mission was a triumph, celebrated worldwide as one of the most daring rescues in modern history. For Amin, it was the ultimate humiliation. His airport had been invaded. His soldiers had been outmaneuvered. His carefully staged image as a protector of Africa had been reduced to farce. The world laughed at him, and laughter was the one sound he could not bear. What he had thought would be his greatest moment became a scar that would never fade. And like all tyrants, he turned humiliation into blood. The target of his revenge was an elderly woman, Dora Bloch, a 75-year-old British-Israeli hostage who had been taken to Malago Hospital in Kampala after choking on food during captivity. When the Israeli commandos stormed Entebbe, she was not among the rescued because she lay in a hospital bed. Amin's fury sought her out. Days after the raid, his secret police arrived at the hospital. Witnesses recalled the scene with horror. Dora Bloch, frail and recovering, was dragged from her bed by armed men in plain clothes. Nurses wept, but could not intervene. Doctors pleaded, but were shoved aside. She was bundled into a waiting car and driven away. She never returned. Her body was later discovered dumped in a sugar plantation near Lugazi, strangled and shot. Even in her last moments, Amin could not resist turning cruelty into theater. Dora Bloch was murdered not for what she had done, but for what she represented. His humiliation at the hands of Israel, his laughter turned to ashes before the world. Her death was both personal vengeance and a message to his own people. If a foreign grandmother could be dragged from a hospital bed and executed, then no Ugandan could hope for mercy. The killing of Dora Bloch unleashed further waves of terror. Amin suspected betrayal among his officers and ordered purges within the army. Soldiers accused of cowardice during the Entebbe raid were executed. Reports circulated of firing squads. At Makindye prison and mass graves dug hurriedly outside Kampala. Civilians, too, felt the aftershock. Roadblocks multiplied. Arrests swelled. The State Research Bureau worked overtime, ensuring that the humiliation at Entebbe was washed away in domestic blood. Internationally, Amin's reputation sank even lower. Britain, already disgusted by his expulsion of Uganda's Asians, now broke off diplomatic ties entirely. The United Nations condemned the murder of Dora Bloch, though Amin continued to deny his responsibility. He even tried to twist the narrative, claiming that foreign agents had killed her to smear his name. But the world no longer listened. The butcher of Uganda was unmasked, and yet, at home, his power persisted. That is the paradox of terror. The people saw through the lies, but they were trapped in the machinery of silence. No amount of ridicule abroad weakened Amin's grip within Uganda. His army, purged and remade in his own image, still answered only to him. His ministers, terrified of sharing the fate of Afambi, Oriama, and Archbishop Luwum, bowed their heads in obedience. The economy might be collapsing, the markets might be empty, but fear is abundant, and fear is the currency of tyranny. The murder of Dora Bloch lingers in the memory of Amin's rule as one of its most grotesque acts, because it was so pointless, so symbolic, and so cold. She was no threat, no rival, no obstacle to his rule. She was simply an old woman who had been unlucky enough to fall ill while trapped in his country at the wrong time. Her fate revealed the heart of Amin's dictatorship. Cruelty for its own sake, cruelty as a balm for wounded pride, cruelty as a spectacle to remind a nation that their ruler's fury was infinite. Entebbe was meant to be Amin's stage of triumph. Instead, it became his mask of shame. And Dora Bloch, a grandmother far from home, became another name in the endless ledger of blood that defined Uganda in the 1970s. Chapter 8: The Collapse of Economy, Black Markets, and the Daily Life of Fear. By the time 1973 settled over Uganda, the promises Amin had made on the radio and on balconies were dissolving into dust. The purge of the army had left barracks soaked in silence. The expulsion of Asians had gutted the nation's commerce, and the killings of officials and priests had extinguished every institution that might resist. What remained was a country staggering on broken legs, its treasury plundered, its shelves empty, and its people forced to survive on scraps while the dictator paraded in medals and costumes. If terror was his iron hand, hunger was his invisible whip, lashing millions of Ugandans day after day until the entire society bowed under its weight. Before Amin's coup, Uganda's economy had been described as one of the most promising in Africa. Coffee exports brought steady income. The Asian community maintained thriving trade networks, keeping goods flowing across the landlocked nation. Schools functioned, hospitals treated the sick, roads and railways still carried freight. But when Amin expelled more than 60,000 Asians in 1972, the heart was ripped out of that system. Shops closed. Factories ground to a halt. Skilled managers and traders vanished overnight. Businesses were handed to soldiers and cronies who had no training and no interest in long-term success. They stripped assets, sold stock, pocketed money, and abandoned the husks. By 1974, Uganda's GDP had plummeted. Coffee, still the main export, was siphoned into black markets where Amin and his cronies pocketed profits. Goods that once flowed through legal channels were now diverted into private warehouses. State ministries became rackets where bribes determined whether supplies ever reached hospitals or schools. Amin personally commandeered the Bank of Uganda, treating it as his purse. He rewarded loyalty with stolen wealth cars, estates, and the very shops that had once belonged to expelled families. The economy no longer existed for the people. It existed only to lubricate his machinery of patronage. The impact was immediate and brutal. By 1975, Kampala's markets had transformed into ghostly spaces. Shelves once stocked with sugar, salt, flour, soap, and kerosene now stood bare. Long queues stretched from dawn to dusk, lines of weary citizens hoping to buy a single bar of soap or a cup of cooking oil. Rationing was enforced, but even ration cards were meaningless unless one had the right bribes. Soldiers at checkpoints confiscated food, demanding contributions to the state. The poor were left with nothing. Hunger sank into villages as well. Farmers found their harvests seized by the army under the pretense of requisition. Families ate one meal a day, often nothing more than cassava and watery porridge. Malnutrition began to spread among children. Hospitals, already emptied of doctors after the Asian expulsion, now lacked medicine, syringes, and even bandages. Nurses turned families away, saying simply, "There is nothing." Amnesty International reported widespread shortages, confirming that even government employees were living on the edge of starvation. The irony was bitter. Uganda was fertile land, rich in resources. Yet its people starved because a dictator had turned the economy into a carcass to be stripped by scavengers. Out of desperation, a shadow economy thrived. The black market became Uganda's true marketplace, where a bar of soap costs 10 times its official price, and sugar was measured out in secret handfuls. Traders smuggled goods from Kenya and Tanzania, risking execution if caught. Ordinary citizens sold possessions just to buy flour. Radios, chairs, bicycles, family heirlooms. Anything of value was bartered for food. This underground market, however, did not escape Amin's grasp. Soldiers and members of the State Research Bureau infiltrated it, extorting traders, seizing goods, and punishing those who dared to profit without giving Amin a share. Stories circulated of traders caught with sacks of sugar being paraded through the streets, beaten, and executed as economic saboteurs. The dictator's voice on the radio thundered against parasites and traitors. Yet the true parasites were in his palace, feasting on the nation's last reserves, while the people gnawed at hunger. Daily life in Amin's Uganda became a gauntlet of fear and deprivation. A trip to the market meant risking arrest at roadblocks, where soldiers demanded bribes or confiscated goods. A trip to the hospital meant finding empty shelves and being told to provide your own medicine, if you could somehow find it on the black market. Teachers abandoned classrooms because salaries went unpaid. Children roamed the streets, hungry and restless, their stomachs swollen with malnutrition. For families, survival required inventiveness and silence. Mothers diluted porridge to stretch meals. Fathers brewed illegal alcohol to barter for food. Neighbors formed networks of mutual aid, whispering when shipments of grain might arrive at hidden warehouses. But above all, people learned not to complain aloud. To speak of shortages was to risk being labeled a saboteur, and saboteurs disappeared. Hunger itself became a political weapon. Anyone who questioned Amin could be accused of undermining the state. Their family left to starve as punishment. At the top of this pyramid of deprivation, Amin and his inner circle feasted. State banquets overflowed with imported delicacies, flown in while Ugandans lined up for salt. Foreign journalists, invited to watch the dictator carve roasted oxen or sip champagne, saw only the surface spectacle. They did not see the gaunt faces in Kampala's alleys or the empty shelves in village shops. Amin's generals grew fat on stolen coffee profits, their wives adorned with jewelry stripped from expelled families. The wealth of an entire nation was compressed into the pockets of a few dozen men, guarded by an army of killers. But Amin's evil genius was to merge hunger with terror. The shortages were not merely the result of incompetence. They became another layer of control. A starving population is less likely to rebel. A man who spends all day queuing for food is less likely to organize against a dictator. By monopolizing access to supplies, Amin ensured that loyalty became transactional. A bar of soap or a tin of flour could be awarded to those who obeyed and withheld from those who questioned. Hunger became a leash, as effective as the gun by the late 1970s. Uganda's economy had collapsed almost entirely. Inflation soared. Infrastructure crumbled. Reports suggested that over half of the country's factories had closed, and those that remained operated at a fraction of capacity. Roads disintegrated, unmaintained. Schools emptied. Hospitals became morgues without medicine. UNICEF reported spikes in infant mortality. A nation that had once been called the Pearl of Africa under British rule was now an open wound, bleeding wealth, knowledge, and life. Yet through it all, Amin stood on balconies, medals glittering, his laughter booming. He blamed Britain, he blamed Israel, he blamed traitors within. He never blamed himself. And his voice on the radio, equal parts clownish and menacing, told Ugandans that their suffering was noble, that their hunger was temporary, that his leadership was divine. The people listened, because not to listen was dangerous. But behind their silence was a gnawing truth. They were dying in slow motion. And the man who claimed to be their father was their executioner. The economy of hunger was not an accident. It was a mirror of Amin's rule built on theft, enforced by violence, and endured by millions who had no escape. Hunger and fear fused together, shaping the daily lives of Ugandans into a bleak ritual. Q. Bribe, survive, remain silent. And this silence was exactly what Amin wanted. A starving nation cannot shout. Chapter 9. The Killing of Friends and the Betrayal of Amin's Inner Circle. By 1977, Uganda was already a graveyard of voices. The army purged, the judiciary shattered, the church silenced, the economy hollowed. Yet one of the most chilling features of Idi Amin's tyranny was his betrayal of his own companions. Loyalty to him was never permanent. It was a candle that could be snuffed out by the faintest suspicion, the faintest shadow of ambition, or the faintest whisper of disloyalty. And in February of that year, 3 men who had once stood at the heart of Amin's government learned that lesson in the darkest way possible. Charles Ofumbi, a Renaud Wilson Oraima, and Archbishop Janani Luwum. We have already seen the Archbishop's fate, the church leader whose courage defied Amin's terror, who was murdered and framed with the laughable lie of a car accident. But his companions that day, Ofumbi and Oraima, deserve their own place in this grim ledger. Their deaths revealed not only Amin's cruelty, but also his paranoia, his willingness to consume his own ministers as fuel for his power. Charles Ofumbi was a man of stature, a respected politician from eastern Uganda who had risen through the ranks to become Minister of Internal Affairs. He was no outsider. He had been part of Uganda's leadership since independence, serving as a trusted figure in successive governments. To Amin, he was useful, a man who understood administration, a minister who gave the appearance of normalcy to a government drowning in violence. But Amin's trust was a poisoned chalice. By 1977, Ofumbi was marked by suspicion. His ties to the old political class, his intellectual demeanor, his quiet reputation as a man of principle, these were enough to breed paranoia in Amin's mind. Worse still, his ministry oversaw internal security, putting him in direct proximity to the State Research Bureau. In Amin's logic, anyone who could understand the machinery of terror was a potential rival who might turn it against him. And so, Ofumbi was summoned to State House on February 16, 1977, accused of treason and executed hours later alongside the Archbishop. Ireneo Oraima's story was equally tragic. Born in the northern Akuli region, he became Uganda's first African Inspector General of Police after independence, later serving as Minister of Lands and Housing. He was a man known for discipline, professionalism, and an unshakable sense of service. His appointment had once symbolized Uganda's potential to grow beyond colonial structures, to have its own capable leaders in the highest posts. But in Amin's Uganda, competence itself was a liability. Oraima's reputation for integrity, his careful professionalism, and his popularity among ordinary citizens made him dangerous in the eyes of a ruler who thrived on chaos. By 1977, Oraima's usefulness had expired. Like Ofumbi, he was summoned under the false accusation of treason, paraded before soldiers, and killed within hours. His body was discarded, his legacy left to be remembered only in whispers until his name resurfaced years later when truth. Commissions reconstructed the events of that day. The murder of Ofumbi and Oraima alongside Luwum was not merely a purge of potential rivals. It was a demonstration, a macabre performance staged to terrify every man and woman still serving in Amin's government. If the Archbishop's death silenced faith, the minister's deaths silenced ambition. Amin had shown his court that loyalty meant nothing. Even dining at his table could end in death. Even serving him faithfully could end with a bullet in the head and a fabricated radio announcement. The announcement itself was farcical. State radio reported that the three men had died in a car accident while trying to escape custody. But Ugandans were not fools. The country knew the truth. Witnesses whispered that they had been shot at close range. Others claimed Amin himself had pulled the trigger. Whether that detail was true or not did not matter. What mattered was the fear it instilled. The lie insulted the people's intelligence, but the insult was deliberate. It was a reminder that the regime did not even need believable lies. It could tell any story it wished, and Ugandans were forced to nod silently as though truth no longer existed. After their deaths, ministers across Amin's government lived like men walking on thin ice. Cabinet meetings became theaters of dread, where each official wondered if he might be next. Even Amin's vice president, Mustafa Idrisi, watched the executions with horror, realizing that proximity to the dictator was a double-edged sword. For the remainder of Amin's reign, Idrisi tiptoed carefully, torn between loyalty and survival. The killings also deepened international outrage. Uganda had already been condemned for the expulsion of Asians, the collapse of its economy, and the atrocities documented by defectors like Henry Kiemba. But the murder of prominent ministers and an archbishop in one stroke shocked even Amin's supporters abroad. Western aid dwindled further. Diplomats fled. Uganda became more isolated, tethered only to Amin's opportunistic alliances with Libya's Muammar Gaddafi and the Palestine Liberation Organization. Yet inside Uganda, his grip remained, sustained by blood and silence. Behind the politics were the families. Ofumbi left behind a wife and children who were given no explanation, only the knowledge that their father had been swallowed by Amin's machine. Ireneo Oraima's family endured the same grief, their loved one stripped from them with no ceremony, no burial, no justice. Their suffering was multiplied by the regime's cruelty. Even mourning was dangerous. To grieve too openly was to risk being accused of disloyalty. And so, families carried their sorrow in silence, their pain folded inward until it became part of the national psyche. These murders' offerings and his inner circle revealed the pattern that defined Amin's rule. Every crisis, every humiliation, every whisper of dissent was answered with blood. He could not tolerate challenge, not from priests, not from generals, not from ministers who had once stood beside him. The only loyalty he recognized was fear, and fear had to be renewed constantly with fresh corpses by killing his own ministers. Amin devoured the very structure of his government. Each murder narrowed his circle of trust. Each betrayal deepened his paranoia. By the late 1970s, he was surrounded not by advisors, but by sycophants. Men too terrified to speak truth. Men who waited only for orders and prayed that their names would not be next on the list. For Uganda, the message was carved deep. The dictator's wrath respected nothing, neither faith, nor friendship, nor loyalty. The same hand that had fed Ofumbi and Oraima turned and struck them down. The same palace that had once hosted their speeches became their tomb. Uganda was by then a land where even power was powerless, where even ministers trembled like common citizens, where survival was measured not by service, but by silence. And that silence, enforced by terror, was the true anthem of Amin's Uganda. Chapter 10. The Final War. Amin's invasion of Tanzania and the fall of Kampala. By 1978, Uganda was exhausted. The people were hungry. The treasury was looted. The prisons overflowed with the disappeared. And the dictator's paranoia had hollowed out his own government. Ministers feared to speak. Generals feared to stand tall. And ordinary citizens feared everything. The knock at the door, the soldier at the checkpoint, the absence of a loved one who never returned from the market. Yet Amin's lust for spectacle and his constant need to cover failure with bravado demanded something even larger than domestic terror. He sought a stage on which he could prove his greatness to the world, to erase humiliation with a gesture of conquest. That stage became his neighbor to the south. Tanzania. And Tanzania had long held tensions. The ousted President Milton Obote, exiled after Amin's coup, had found sanctuary in Tanzania. From camps along the border, Obote's loyalists plotted a return. Skirmishes had flared, accusations traded. But in late October 1978, Amin made a fateful miscalculation. Claiming that Tanzania was harboring rebels, he ordered Ugandan troops across the border, seizing a strip of Tanzanian land. He declared it annexed to Uganda, a trophy of his strength. On state radio, he boasted that Uganda's borders were expanding, that he was a conqueror, rewriting maps. What he had not counted on was Tanzania's response. Nyerere, long patient with Amin's provocations, now unleashed his army. With the support of Ugandan exiles desperate to reclaim their country, Tanzanian forces began to move north. It was the first time Amin faced a disciplined external enemy, and the result was devastating. The Ugandan army, rebuilt after the purge of the Akoli and Plunged, was loyal but brittle. Many of its officers were chosen for ethnicity and allegiance rather than skill. Corruption rotted its supply chains. Soldiers were paid with loot, not salaries. Morale depended on fear, not confidence. Against the Tanzanians, they faltered by early 1979. Tanzanian troops and Ugandan exiles, later known as the Uganda National Liberation Front, UNLF, swept across the border. Town after town fell. Ugandan soldiers deserted in waves. Some fought fiercely, others fled at the first shots. Amin raged at the betrayal, ordering executions of officers accused of cowardice. But the truth was plain. The army that had terrorized unarmed civilians was no match for disciplined soldiers who fought with purpose. As the war dragged into 1979, the tide turned fully against Amin. Reports spread of Ugandan troops fleeing with looted radios and chickens, abandoning tanks without fuel, shooting deserters to slow the rot. The Tanzanians, moving deliberately, pressed northward, capturing Masaka and Mbarara, and finally closing in on Kampala itself. Inside the capital, fear curdled into anticipation. The city was divided between dread of the unknown and desperate hope for deliverance. For years, the people had been silenced by Amin's terror. Now, as artillery thundered closer, whispers spread like fire. Perhaps the nightmare was ending. Yet the danger was immense. Amin's men were still present, still brutal, and their paranoia deepened as defeat loomed. Killings spiked in the final months. Suspected traitors, real or imagined, were executed to feed the dictator's need for vengeance. On April 11, 1979, Tanzanian forces and Ugandan exiles entered Kampala. The city shook with the crack of shells and gunfire, but resistance quickly collapsed. Amin's soldiers melted away. Some fought, some fled in stolen cars, some stripped off uniforms and hid among civilians. By afternoon, the Tanzanian flag flew over key government buildings. Crowds poured into the streets, cheering, though their joy was laced with exhaustion. For the first time in 8 years, Kampala breathed without Amin's shadow pressing on its lungs. Idi Amin himself was nowhere to be found. As the Tanzanians closed in, he fled first to his home region of West Nile, then across the border into Libya, where his ally Gaddafi offered refuge. From there he would drift into Saudi Arabia, living in luxury for decades, while Uganda struggled to rebuild. He never faced trial. He never confessed. He never atoned. When the dust settled, the scope of Amin's crimes began to emerge in clearer relief. Bodies were exhumed from mass graves near Namambe, Umbo, and along the banks of the Nile. Survivors testified of executions in the basements of Nile mansions, of torture chambers at Makindi, of prisoners drowned in the waters of Lake Victoria with stones tied around their necks. International human rights groups estimated that between 300,000 and 500,000 Ugandans had perished under Amin's 8-year rule. It was a figure so vast it defied comprehension. Yet it matched the memories of countless families who had lost fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters into the maw of disappearance. The collapse of Amin's regime also exposed the devastation of the economy. Shops were empty, industries shuttered, infrastructure decayed. Roads lay in ruin, hospitals functioned without medicine, schools lacked teachers. The nation was a husk, bled dry by years of theft and mismanagement. The Pearl of Africa had become a wasteland dot in Kampala. Jubilant crowds tore down Amin's portraits, smashing his framed face in government buildings. Statues were toppled, medals scattered. His voice, once unavoidable on the radio, fell silent. Yet the celebration was tempered with sorrow. For every family dancing in the streets, another mourned someone who would never return. Mothers carried pictures of missing sons. Fathers whispered the names of daughters taken at roadblocks. The victory was real, but the wound was immeasurable. For Ugandans, Amin's flight into exile was both a relief and an insult. Relief because the terror had ended. Insult because the man responsible escaped justice. In Saudi Arabia, he lived comfortably, tended by servants and protected by international politics. Meanwhile, the people he had ruled struggled to rebuild from the ashes. It was the final cruelty of his story that the butcher of Uganda never faced the courtroom he so richly deserved. The war that ended Amin's rule left scars that outlived him. Thousands of Ugandan soldiers, guilty and innocent alike, were killed in the retreat. The borderlands were left devastated. Refugees streamed across the region, carrying tales of terror and famine. Uganda itself fell into years of instability as rival factions fought to fill the vacuum Amin left. Obote would return, only to preside over another era of blood. The nightmare had not ended, only shifted. But for a brief moment, as Tanzanian soldiers marched through Kampala in April 1979, Uganda glimpsed light. Crowds gathered, singing, tears streaming down faces that had forgotten how to smile. For 8 years they had been ruled by fear, hunger, and death. Now at last the silence broke. Amin never returned. He settled in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, under the protection of the royal family. He swam in pools, prayed in mosques, and lived out his days in comfort until his death in 2003. He claimed he had been a misunderstood patriot, even expressing no regret in interviews. For the victims, his exile was a bitter reminder that justice is not guaranteed. Uganda, meanwhile, carried the scars. The graves, the hunger, the silence, the ruined economy, all bore testimony to a man whose reign had been a symphony of horror. And though the guns had fallen silent, the echoes of his rule would haunt the nation for generations. Chapter 11: Exile, Memory, and the Ghost of Amin. When Kampala fell in April 1979, Idi Amin did not face his people or the wreckage he had left behind. He slipped away, first to Libya under the wing of Muammar Gaddafi, and then to Saudi Arabia, where the royal family opened its arms to him. There, in the holy city of Jeddah, the butcher of Uganda was given sanctuary. It was an insult sharper than any knife. While Uganda buried its dead in mass graves and starved through the ruins of his theft, Amin lounged in seaside villas, prayed in marble mosques, and swam in turquoise pools. Saudi Arabia offered him not merely refuge, but comfort. He was sheltered from extradition, shielded from courts, and fed on the wealth of kings. He lived with multiple wives, fathered more children, and walked the streets as though he were a retired elder than a man responsible for the slaughter of hundreds of thousands. His presence in Saudi Arabia was barely acknowledged, whispered about, hidden from view, yet he lived without fear, guarded by men whose duty was to ensure he never saw a trial. Uganda, meanwhile, struggled to breathe. The economy was broken, institutions dismantled, and graves filled with the anonymous dead. Survivors spoke their stories into the void, while the world allowed Amin to die in comfort. When he finally passed in 2003, he was buried quietly in Jeddah, far from the land he had drenched in blood. No tribunal, no reckoning, no apology. History will not remember Saudi Arabia's protection as benevolence, but as complicity. They hid a monster, and in doing so, denied justice to the nation he butchered. Amin's ghost lingers not in Uganda's soil, but in the shame of those who kept him safe, while his victims were left to rot uncounted.